Hi, everybody. Welcome to The Right Side with Doug Billings. Thank you for watching. Thank you for subscribing to the YouTube channel. We're also over on Rumble. Subscribe to us on YouTube. That's our main platform, but we do have a backup channel on Rumble as well. And we are on all of the major podcast platforms out there. So make sure you subscribe to us out there in the land of podcasts as well. We also have a GoFundMe page. You can subscribe, become a monthly sponsor, a weekly sponsor. We would appreciate it. The conservative message of this program has been just accepted around the world. We are honored and blessed by all of you who support us. And you'll notice that I get out there in those comments and I try to engage with you and answer as many of those comments as I can. There's thousands of them, but I do appreciate it. And I look forward to getting to know you and maybe even meeting some of you one of these days. That would be great. In today's show, I want to focus on a trend in education that I would wager to say is not only a problem in America, but it's a worldwide problem. And in the United States, we have first came along this liberal indoctrination of our children of all ages, from grade school all the way up through the university system. It was called, or is called, the 1619 Project. And we have President Trump, who engaged in and created and commissioned what he called the 1776 Commission to countermeasure the terrible teaching of history that the 1619 Project puts forth. So today I want to talk about the difference between those two ideologies, primarily by pointing out the lies of the 1619 Project and giving you the truth based on the founding of America, the America founding fathers, and juxtapose their truths against what is lied about and slandered about them in the 1619 Project. So let me give you a little bit of some backdrop here. In the United States, these two educational ideologies that are prevalent, and again, as I said, I would wager to say that you around the world will notice this as well. Under one of these proposals, you will see that the ideals of patriotism and divine providence of God and the creation of an American republic through the intervention of divine providence with our founders says that it's all racist at its core. It's all immoral at our core, and that the founders were white supremacists, right? Well, let me begin with three evidences of what's going on in education in the United States, and you tell me if you think that it's going on in your country as well. So for decades, number one, much of academia, the liberal activist class, right? The ones that are out there in your face that are just crazy liberal educators. For the last decade or so, and this is happening in the public school systems here, it's happening in their school unions, teachers unions, etc. They've operated on the premise that America is fundamentally racist. All right, point number one. Number two, they say and they claim in the 1619 Project that the American founding fathers saw slavery as something that they wanted to protect, when it's the exact opposite that's true. Every one of our American founding fathers saw slavery as evil. We'll talk more about that. And point number three, I think that instead of indulging ourselves in recrimination, and I think that we would be wise if we all followed the advice of President Abraham Lincoln, who said that we should seek to, quote, bind up the nation's wounds, end quote. Not tear us apart, not tear down history. In the United States, and again, like I said, I'll bet you that around the world, academia is where I'm going to start. And I'll start with the 1619 Project and give some background and introduction and juxtapose it to the truth. Academia in America is comprised of liberal activists and public school systems, teachers' unions, administrations of schools, I'm talking grade school all the way through the university system, who approach history, especially with the premise that America is fundamentally racist, flawed, evil, and had no intention of being anything but that. The latest production of all of this rancor is in and encompassed by the 1619 Project. It was first published in 2019 by the New York Times. And it claims that, and I'm going to quote here from it, anti-black racism runs in the very DNA of this country, end quote. I'm going to have a lot of quotes for you today. And it also said, quote, that it aims to reframe, this is what the 1619 Project claims it wants to do, quote, to reframe the country's history, end quote. So by marking 1619, what they're doing is they're blaming you, my British friends, you awful colonizing British. You introduced slavery to Virginia. That was, according to the 1619 Project, quote, the year of our true founding, end quote. You see, the authors of the 1619 Project, ladies and gentlemen, have They don't only slander America with a false narrative, they're going to call out our brothers and sisters in England and do the same thing to them. But the Times wanted to encourage public schools to adopt this curriculum and instruction model that would aim to save America from white supremacy. Right. Yeah, right. It's brainwashing and it's dangerous. It's evil, it's treacherous, it's dishonest. The New York Times, in fact, the whole Communist Socialist Party, now that I think about it, not just the New York Times, the Communist Socialist movement in America and around the world encourages public schools, education in general, to adopt this curriculum and instruction model, and it spreads the 1619 Project's message to our youth to brainwash them into a false history and lead them to false conclusions, labeling our founding documents, the Declaration of Independence and the United States Constitution, labeling them as immoral and not worthy of our loyalty, much less our allegiance. You see, in order to shame America's founding, you see, we have to hide the truth. We have to ignore it. We have to overtly misrepresent the founders' writings and their very words, their thoughts, all of the founding fathers, their writing. They all have to be misrepresented, lied about. What the communist socialists who put forth these ideas don't tell you is that every one of the founding fathers were against slavery and did not ever endorse it. That's exactly the opposite of what the 1619 Project will tell you. They saw, the founders did, they saw slavery as evil from the beginning and weren't shy about writing about it and speaking about it. George Washington said, I'm going to quote him, "There isn't a man living who wishes more sincerely than I do to see a plan adopted for the abolition of slavery," end quote. And Thomas Jefferson's original draft of the United States Declaration of Independence calls the slave trade, quote, an unexcusable commerce, an evil commerce. And he called it an outrage against human nature itself. You all remember, don't you, not only here in America but around the world, you remember last summer when you saw the anarchy, the riots, the looting, the burning in cities that are run and managed by the Communist Socialist Party? Those riots were carried out by people who are the electoral base of the Communist Socialist Party. They toppled and they vandalized statues of George Washington and Thomas Jefferson. To them, those statues symbolize a history that must be changed, a history that must be eradicated to fit the Communist Socialist narrative. You want more? There's more founders who spoke out against it. Governor Morris called slavery, quote, a nefarious institution and, quote, the curse of heaven, end quote. John Jay, another famous figure in our American history, said, quote, it is much to be wished that slavery may be abolished. It's much to wish it, to contend for our own liberty, but to deny that blessing to others involves an inconsistency that cannot be excused, end quote. There are others. Benjamin Franklin, James Madison, John Adams, Alexander Hamilton. The list goes on. They all spoke vehemently against the institution of slavery. Now, ladies and gentlemen, the intellectually immature out there, the intellectually immature of the world would argue that those statements from the founders were only meant to make them look good, to enhance their public image. They didn't really mean it. Obviously, they didn't. Look what they did to this nation. They founded it with their white supremacy and their racism. Yeah, the intellectually immature might claim that the founders didn't face any pressure whatsoever to disguise either their private or their public speeches and writings, or that no statements exist from the founders about elaborating on and creating a collective defense of human inequality, or arguments that natural rights are based on race. You see, slavery, ladies and gentlemen, slavery was a pre-revolutionary inheritance that the American founders and the principles of the American Revolution unanimously condemned. The founders were aware. They were aware that they were creating a republic and a nation based on natural human equality, that it was intended to overturn the old world's supremacist ideologies, both from the standpoint of feudalism and from monarchy. The American Revolution's equity principle, you don't hear about it anymore, I think, in history classes, but I remember learning about it. The equity principle, as they called it, would, they hoped, form the basis on which America would eventually abolish slavery. That was the intent of the founders. But still, the New York Times, which didn't even use citations of any of the founding documents, no qualifications of factual information or assertions of the founders, with no hesitation, they published non-contextual information and claimed that, quote, one of the primary reasons the colonists decided to declare their independence from Britain was because they wanted to protect the institution of slavery. That's what the New York Times said. The Times 1619 report said that colonial independence from Britain was, quote, required in order to ensure that slavery would continue, end quote. A lie. Now, as you look back and you think, how did the Times possibly think that the Founding Fathers wanted to continue slavery? To give them the benefit of the doubt, they might have been talking about the Somerset versus Stuart case in America, which was a 1772 British judicial ruling that held that a slave, in this case James Somerset, could not be sold to a plantation in Jamaica against his will. Now, in that decision, Chief Justice Lord Mansfield illustrated that slavery, quote, is so terrible, so horrible, odious was his word, that nothing can be suffered to support it. Nothing can be suffered to support it but positive laws. But that ruling didn't abolish slavery. It didn't even have legal standing in the colonies. So I only assume that's what the Times might have been talking about. But at this point in American history, colonial resistance against British rule had already begun. And there was nowhere in the writings of the founders do they describe the revolution itself with a fear that slavery would be taken away from them or abolished. So whenever you're confronted with someone who supports this ridiculous 1619 project or advocates for it, you should ask them specifically, specifically, ask them and write this down. Where in the founders' writings, in any of the founding fathers' writings of the leading revolutionaries of that day, do they make any demands whatsoever that gives references or a desire to keep or to enable slavery? Ask the communist socialist who confronts you with the 1619 Project that question. Point to any one of the founding fathers' writings, speeches, diaries, journals, where they hope and pray and preach for or make a case for the continuance of slavery. Because you won't find it, ladies and gentlemen. They won't find it. I mean, if anything, again, John Jay, he notes the equality principle of the revolution and began this, which caused many, many Americans to go against slavery. In America, most of you would know, I think, that the region that was most strenuously revolutionary was New England. It led to the first abolition movement. Prior to the era of the Revolution, you'd be hard-pressed to find any public speeches or discussions or anything about the injustices of slavery. But during the Revolution and just prior to it, it all opens up the doors, and the equality principle was adopted, began to be discussed, and almost immediately, ladies and gentlemen, 8 states, 8 of them, there were only 13 at the time, either by their legislatures or by their local courts, began to abolish slavery. Now, after the Declaration of Independence, this all began to snowball. Vermont abolished slavery in 1777. Pennsylvania abolished it in 1780. Massachusetts and New Hampshire in 1783. Connecticut and Rhode Island in 1784. New York and New Jersey, 1799 for New York and 1804 for New Jersey. There's massive amounts of evidence showing that the founders wanted to end slavery. The New York Times claims that, quote, neither Jefferson nor most of the founders intended to abolish slavery, end quote. That is an abject lie. John Adams argued, quote, got a lot of quotes for you, because this is important. Very important to get it right and to quote the founders themselves in their own words, which the New York Times didn't do. John Adams argued, quote, every measure of prudence, therefore, ought to be assumed for the eventual total elimination of slavery from the United States, end quote. You see, John Adams hoped that the inequalities of the old world, as I mentioned before, would eventually all disappear. And you know, all of the founders held that hope. Ladies and gentlemen, in 1778, Thomas Jefferson, in 1778, introduced a bill in his Virginia legislature that banned the importation of slavery. And he put his hope on that bill that it would lead to slavery's, quote, final eradication, in his words, from the country. This is why you've got to take the education of your children seriously and underneath your own control. Now, I'm not talking about you all becoming homeschoolers. I'm saying that you've got to become involved in your local school boards. You've got to hold university professors and instructors accountable to the truth. You adults who are in college-age kids, hold them accountable to the truth of history. Because according to the communist socialist and the liberal academia activist class, not only are the founders evil, their narrative says so, but also that their most major achievement. Now think for a moment. What would be the founding fathers' most major accomplishment? The Constitution. Some might say the Declaration of Independence, but the Constitution itself is the pinnacle achievement of the founders. And the left, the communist socialists, the academic radicals, will say that it's a contaminated document. And they'll say this in the 1619 Project, quote, "The Constitution is evil. The framers carefully constructed a document that preserved and protected slavery without ever using the word," end quote. But the facts, ladies and gentlemen, the truth, the point is the exact opposite. The founders laid the constitutional groundwork for eliminating slavery. You want an example of that? All right. In the Constitution, Article 1, Section 9, Clause 1. It states that Congress could prohibit importation of slaves starting in 1808. On the first day that clause was adopted, Congress passed and President Thomas Jefferson signed that bill into law, that article into law, saying that Thomas Jefferson was pro-slavery, that he wanted it to continue. Congress also took in those days other steps to limit slavery. The Northwest Ordinance on 1787, look it up. It outlawed slavery in the Northwestern Territories. It was passed. Then 7 years later, Congress made it illegal to build ships for the slave trade. Look, ladies and gentlemen, politics existed back then, obviously. And it's true that in order to get votes to ratify the Constitution, the founders agreed to allow slavery to continue for a limited time. North and South Carolina, for example, along with Georgia, would never have ratified the Constitution otherwise. That political deal was made, however, on the contention that and the agreement that the founders considered it to be prudential and acceptable because in their own mind and in their words, they thought that it was better to have the union of states together than it was to have war among the states. You don't get the truth from the communist socialists and the mainstream media. Here's another example of the contrast. The Constitution of the Confederacy, for example. Now, they were in complete favor of slavery. Obviously, they stated in the Constitution that no law would be passed, quote, impairing the right of property in Negro slaves, end quote. Juxtapose that to what James Madison said and the framers and himself when they omitted the word slave or any classification by race from the Constitution. All men are created equal. They didn't say all free men, all non-slaves, all white people. They left it out and they highlighted that in order to highlight humanity for all people, slave and otherwise. Madison wrote, quote, "They are persons. They are not property, not chattel. We cannot admit into the Constitution of the United States," these are Madison's words, "the idea that there could be property in men," end quote. You see, Madison wanted the slave to be viewed as, according to his writings, quote, as a moral person, not as a mere article or property, end quote. James Madison. Now, Frederick Douglass comes along, and he was not wrong in his belief that the Union was indispensable. It was an indispensable condition of abolition. It had to happen. It would be either that or the northern influence of over the South would eradicate it. Okay, that in other words, he was hoping that the attitudes of the northern states would slowly influence and filter down and percolate through the southern states, and slavery would be ended that way, and that was, by the way, what the founders hoped for, or Frederick Douglass said that it would end slavery, America would, by a just and moral war against it. And history's truth is that the South would not have abolished slavery if it was left to its own rule. and therefore the Civil War in America. You know, another thing that the left continually and purposefully leave out of the narrative is that America, and this is the truth, America had about 60,000 free blacks at the time of the founding of this republic. And that number tripled in about 20 years. Ladies and gentlemen, black Americans voted in several states, which made America the first country in recorded history where blacks and whites voted together side by side. Justice for all was born in America, ladies and gentlemen. It isn't systematically racist. It is not in our DNA to be so. Fight back against that claim every time you see it on social media, every time you hear it. Don't allow for a single day to go by where you see one of those kinds of comments and not address it. Don't allow for your children for a single week, a semester, a quarter, a year to be taught that kind of history that's perpetuated in the 1619 Project. The notion that white supremacists founded our republic. False on its face and abhorrent to even think. Now look, I know, and all of you know, that in our history, black Americans have been treated terribly and unjustly. But the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution, according to the founders' intent, both of those documents hold within their pages the principles through and by which justice would come to us. That's what Frederick Douglass and Martin Luther King both said in their own words. But all of these truths are completely and decisively and purposefully left out of the communist-socialist narrative in America and around the world. You won't see those, the truth, in classrooms, or at least not in very many classrooms around the United States. There is one thing that the Communist Socialist Party wants to do and is doing. And so is the media. The media in the United States. They are attempting to inform and educate us by the arts of distortion and deception. A couple of other things about Frederick Douglass and Martin Luther King Jr. Neither of them had any mention in their speeches or writings that demanded the idea of reparations for the past. And I think for one patriot, in my own opinion, we should all take again, as I mentioned at the beginning, a lesson from Abraham Lincoln, President Lincoln, the founder of the Republican Party. He said that we should bind up the wounds of this nation. He wanted us to be able to, in his words, to achieve and cherish a just and lasting peace among ourselves. Ladies and gentlemen, if we manipulate, trick, and deceive students into believing that the founding intention and implementation of the American Republic was racist, or if it was unjust and purposefully and inherently evil, we're not only lying to our fellow citizens and our future generations, we're committing one hell of a sin. The American experiment continues to be a beacon of light to the world. And I know you listening and watching around the world understand that, because you tell me that in messages that I receive from you every day. It is a beacon of moral light to the entire world. And I hope that this light continues to beam brightly to people around the world, not only in America, but around the world. And I do believe that truth will prevail. I'm a believer in truth. I'm a believer in God, who is truth. But we need to stand in determined prayer and determined patriotism, ladies and gentlemen, to fight the lies of the 1619 Project and to support and defend President Trump's 1776 Commission. Truth over lies Intellectual maturity over intellectual immaturity, that's the difference. Truth and intellectual maturity. They both reside on the right side. Determined patriotism. Please, ladies and gentlemen, with determined prayer. Thank you. I had to talk about this because the American education system, and I'm only presuming that the educational systems around the country, around the world, are in the same predicament. The radical left infiltrating the minds of our youth, converting history before our very eyes to something that's false, not true. So this conservative message needs to continue. I am appreciative of all of the hundreds of thousands of folks that watch it. Over 4 million people have seen it since January, this show. Thank you. God bless you for that. I'm honored and blessed by that. Share the message. If you would kindly stop by the GoFundMe page, become a sponsor of the program. We will endeavor to create good content, conservative content, godly content that will hopefully inspire, inform, teach, and inform you about not only news and politics of the day, but faith, God, and how we can continue together as a unified people around the globe in determined prayer and determined patriotism. All right. As I always remind you, you have a pack of blessings on your backs, ladies and gentlemen. Take inventory of those blessings every day. Give thanks to God for them. We will meet again right here on the right side with Doug Billings. You can count on that. God bless you. Cheers.